Imagine a world where the unthinkable happened. It is early 1942, and the Japanese Empire, emboldened by its devastating strike on Pearl Harbor just weeks earlier, makes the boldest and most reckless military gamble in modern history. Instead of consolidating its rapidly expanding Pacific Island empire, Imperial Japan launches a full-scale invasion of the American mainland. This is the story of what might have been, a terrifying alternate history where foreign soldiers march on American soil for the first time since the War of 1812, and where the fate of the free world hangs in the balance on the beaches and farmlands of California. In Tokyo, inside the dimly lit chambers of the Imperial General Headquarters, Admiral Yamamoto and the senior military leadership study their maps with obsessive focus. The plan is audacious beyond measure. 6 fleet carriers, the same force that devastated Pearl Harbor, accompanied by 4 battleships, a dozen cruisers, and an enormous transport fleet carrying over 120,000 soldiers, will cross the vast Pacific Ocean under complete radio silence. Their primary target is the western coast of the United States, specifically the critical ports, oil refineries, and military installations stretching from San Francisco south to San Diego. Yamamoto himself harbors deep reservations about this operation. He studied at Harvard, he toured American factories and shipyards. He knows what America is capable of producing when fully motivated. The supply lines will stretch thousands of miles across open ocean, vulnerable to submarine attack and air interdiction at every single point along the route. But the militarists who dominate the Tokyo government believe that a single decisive blow on American soil will shatter civilian morale and force Washington to negotiate a favorable peace that preserves Japanese conquests across Asia. The Japanese fleet departs its home waters in absolute secrecy, sailing a northern route through the rough and frigid waters of the North Pacific to avoid commercial shipping lanes and detection by long-range patrol aircraft. On the flight decks of the carriers, hundreds of Mitsubishi Zero fighters and Nakajima torpedo bombers are fueled, armed, and covered with tarps against the salt spray. Young pilots receive their final briefings in cramped ready rooms below deck, studying hand-drawn maps of San Francisco Bay, the sprawling port facilities of Los Angeles, and the military airfields scattered along the California coast. These men have been told they are sailing toward a mission of enormous consequence for the empire, but few among them truly comprehend the industrial colossus they are about to challenge, a nation that can produce more steel in a single week than Japan manufactures in a month. Meanwhile, on the American West Coast, life continues with the nervous but strangely normal energy of a nation recently attacked but not yet fully mobilized for total war. Families go about their daily routines, fathers heading to work, mothers shopping for groceries, children walking to school, all while reading newspapers filled with alarming war headlines from both the Pacific and European theaters. Factories along the coast are beginning their conversion from consumer goods to military production, but the full might of the American industrial machine has not yet been unleashed. Coastal defenses are alarmingly thin. Radar coverage is primitive and spotty at best. The bulk of available military forces and equipment are being prepared for deployment to Europe to support the British and to the Pacific Islands to halt the Japanese advance there. The western coastline of America is, in early 1942, remarkably and dangerously vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack that is now approaching across the Pacific horizon. The first warning comes in the dead of night when a small, understaffed radar station, perched on a rocky promontory along the coast, picks up an enormous and unprecedented cluster of contacts approaching from the west. The young operators, barely out of training, stare at their primitive circular screens in disbelief as the green phosphor dots multiply before their eyes. They scramble to telephone their superiors, but initially their reports are met with skepticism. It must be a malfunction, or perhaps a flock of migrating birds confusing the equipment. Precious minutes are lost before the reality of the situation sinks in. Within the hour, alarm bells ring through every military installation on the West Coast, but there is desperately little time to react. Before dawn breaks over the California hills, the Japanese fleet has positioned itself within striking distance of the coast, and the first massive wave of carrier aircraft is already airborne, over 300 planes streaking toward the shore in tight formations that seem to darken the early morning sky. The bombardment begins with a thunderous roar that echoes across the coastal waters as Japanese battleships and heavy cruisers open fire on coastal installations with their enormous deck guns. Massive shells, each weighing over a ton, arc through the morning air and slam into harbor facilities, oil storage tanks, military docks and communication towers. The explosions are visible for dozens of miles, sending towering columns of fire and thick black smoke spiraling thousands of feet into the sky. Simultaneously, waves of Japanese aircraft descend upon airfields, ammunition depots and military bases up and down the coast, catching many American planes still on the ground, destroying them before they can even take off. Air raid sirens wail across coastal cities as panicked civilians flood into the streets, many still in their nightclothes, looking skyward at the formations of enemy aircraft overhead. The scenes are horrifyingly reminiscent of Pearl Harbor, but this time the attack is happening on the American homeland itself, on streets where children play and families gather for Sunday dinner. American defenders respond with everything they have available, which in those first desperate hours is far too little. Anti-aircraft batteries pour fire into the sky, their tracers streaking upward in bright lines. The few fighter squadrons that manage to get airborne scramble into the chaos and engage in desperate dogfights over the burning coastline. P-40 Warhawks, with their distinctive shark-mouth nose art, clash with nimble Japanese Zeros in violent, swirling aerial combat. Both sides take heavy losses in those opening exchanges. On the ground below, coastal defense units man their positions with grim determination, checking ammunition supplies and reinforcing sandbagged positions as they prepare for the previously unthinkable possibility of enemy troops actually coming ashore on American beaches. And come ashore they do. Japanese landing craft hit the beaches of Northern California in the cold. Gray light of early morning, their flat bows dropping open to disgorge hundreds of soldiers at a time into the churning surf. Thousands of troops wade through waist-deep Pacific water and scramble onto the sandy shore, establishing beachheads under withering fire from the defending American positions above. Light tanks roll off specialized transport barges and grind their metal tracks up through the wet sand, providing mobile cover and firepower for the infantry pushing inland. The fighting is immediate and absolutely ferocious. American soldiers behind sandbag fortifications and in hastily dug fighting positions pour rifle and heavy machine gun fire into the advancing waves of attackers. The beach becomes a chaotic landscape of noise, smoke, and desperate courage on both sides. But the sheer overwhelming number of Japanese landing forces arriving in wave after wave from the massive fleet offshore begins to push back and eventually overwhelm the thin American defensive line. Within days, Japanese forces have secured a substantial coastal foothold and begun their push inland along every available road and highway. Small California towns fall under foreign military occupation as the invaders advance through golden farmland and along tree-lined highway corridors. The sight of Japanese soldiers marching through the main streets of American towns, past diners and gas stations and schoolhouses, raising their rising sun flag over city halls and post offices, sends absolute shockwaves through the entire nation. It is a sight no American ever imagined they would see. President Roosevelt addresses the country by radio from the Oval Office, his voice steady and resolute, but carrying the unmistakable gravity of the moment, calling for total and immediate national mobilization on a scale never before attempted. Every factory must produce for the war. Every farm must feed the defenders. Every citizen, man and woman, young and old, must contribute everything they have to the defense of the homeland. The American response, initially stunned and chaotic and marked by confusion in the chain of command, begins to organize itself with a speed and determination that astonishes even the most optimistic military planners. The sleeping giant that Yamamoto had warned his colleagues about is truly awakening now, and it is awakening in a state of absolute fury. Military trains loaded with troops, tanks, artillery, and mountains of supplies rush westward day and night from every corner of the continental United States. Entire divisions originally earmarked for deployment to North Africa and Europe are redirected to the Western Front. National Guard units from landlocked states that never expected to see combat on home soil mobilize within hours of the call. And in the communities behind the shifting front lines, ordinary American citizens, farmers and shopkeepers and factory workers form guerrilla resistance groups armed with hunting rifles, shotguns, and an intimate knowledge of the local terrain to harass and disrupt Japanese supply lines, communication networks, and rear area installations. The Japanese advance, initially impressive in its speed and momentum, begins almost immediately to encounter the fundamental strategic problems that Yamamoto himself had privately feared would doom the operation. Supply lines stretching across the entire breadth of the Pacific Ocean, over 5,000 miles of open water, proved to be incredibly and fatally vulnerable. American submarines, operating aggressively from bases in Hawaii and along the coast, begin taking a devastating and accelerating toll on Japanese transport ships, sending desperately needed ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and food to the bottom of the ocean. For every ton of supplies that reaches the invasion force, 3 tons are lost to submarine torpedoes. The Japanese forces fighting ashore find themselves pushing deeper and deeper into a vast continent with a fiercely hostile population and increasingly powerful and well-organized military opposition, while their own ability to resupply, reinforce, and sustain the fight dwindles more dramatically with each passing day. The American counterattacks, when they come, arrive with devastating and overwhelming effectiveness. The industrial capacity of the United States, now fully and fanatically dedicated to the war effort with factories running 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days a week, produces tanks, aircraft, artillery, ammunition, and every conceivable piece of military equipment at a pace Japan cannot begin to approach or even comprehend. Brand new Sherman tanks roll off the assembly lines in Detroit and are loaded directly onto flatbed rail cars bound for the California front, arriving within days of their manufacture. P-38 Lightning twin-engine fighters, fast and deadly, establish uncontested air superiority over the entire battle zone. Formations of B-17 Flying Fortress, heavy bombers, conduct systematic strategic strikes on Japanese supply depots, command posts, and defensive positions, methodically destroying the infrastructure of the occupation. The American military machine, once it achieves full engagement and operational momentum, reveals itself to be an absolutely unstoppable force of industrial production, manpower, and tactical adaptation. The decisive turning point arrives when American forces launch a massive and brilliantly coordinated 2-pronged counteroffensive designed to trap and annihilate the entire Japanese occupation force. A powerful northern force, spearheaded by armored divisions, pushes aggressively through the mountain passes of Northern California, while an equally formidable southern force sweeps rapidly through the inland valleys and desert terrain of Southern California. The two forces drive like the jaws of an enormous vice, closing on the shrinking Japanese-held pocket along the coast. Simultaneously, the reconstituted American Pacific Fleet executes a devastating series of naval engagements that systematically destroy every remaining Japanese carrier, battleship, and transport vessel operating off the California coast. The rising sun flag no longer flies over any ship within 1,000 miles of American waters, cut off completely from any possibility of resupply and reinforcement. Surrounded on three sides by overwhelming American military force, with nothing behind them but the vast, empty Pacific Ocean, the Japanese occupation forces face a strategically impossible and utterly hopeless situation. The final battles to liberate occupied American territory are fierce, bloody, and costly for soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Street by street, block by block, house by house, American forces methodically reclaim their cities and towns from the occupiers. The fighting in urban areas proves particularly brutal and heartbreaking, with soldiers clearing damaged buildings room by room, fighting through the ruins of American homes, schools, and churches. But the ultimate outcome is no longer in any doubt. Japanese forces, their ammunition nearly exhausted, their food supplies gone, their air cover completely eliminated, and their supporting fleet destroyed or scattered, begin to lay down their weapons and surrender in increasingly large numbers. The moment a white flag appears above the Japanese field headquarters in a battered downtown building, a tidal wave of relief, exhaustion, and overwhelming emotion washes over the entire American nation from coast to coast. The aftermath of the invasion reshapes the United States of America in fundamental and permanent ways that echo through the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The invasion, though ultimately and decisively defeated, leaves deep and lasting scars on the national consciousness that will never fully heal. Entire communities along the California coast need to be rebuilt from the foundations up. Thousands of American military personnel and civilians have given their lives in defense of the homeland. The psychological impact of seeing enemy soldiers on American streets, of watching American towns burn, changes something fundamental in the national character. But from this terrible crucible of crisis and sacrifice emerges a nation transformed, more united in purpose and more determined in resolve than it has ever been at any point in its history. Coastal defenses along every shoreline are permanently and massively strengthened. The American military undergoes a complete top-to-bottom restructuring based on the harsh lessons learned during the invasion and liberation campaigns, and the colossal industrial base that surged into existence to meet the existential crisis becomes the unshakable foundation of American global superpower status for generations to come. The veterans who fought in the defense and liberation of the American homeland carry the weight and meaning of their experiences for every remaining day of their lives. Bronze and granite memorials are erected along the coast, on the beaches where the landings occurred, in the towns that endured occupation, and on the hillsides where the fiercest battles raged. The invasion and its defeat become a defining and sacred chapter in the national story, taught with reverence in every American school and commemorated with solemn ceremonies each year. The Japanese gamble that was designed to break the American will to fight instead, and forge that will into something permanent and unbreakable, born of strategic desperation and catastrophic miscalculation. The invasion achieved the precise opposite of everything it intended, transforming a wounded nation still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor into the most formidable military, industrial, and economic power the world had ever witnessed, a power that would shape the course of global history for the next century and beyond.